When Steve Harvey wore his cross necklace on air, he didn't know the legend Morgan Freeman came to deliver a message that would bring him to his knees and left the entire studio in tears. The lights were warm. The laughter was real. The kind that fills a room not because someone's trying too hard, but because someone like Steve Harvey is standing center stage, doing what he does best. The Steve Show had that easy-going energy, the kind you feel before dinner with family, familiar, unforced, a little messy in the best way. The audience clapped, whistled, and leaned forward in their seats as Steve finished his opening monologue, a mix of stand-up wisdom and playful jabs at the producers in the back, who, as he put it, still think they can tell a grown man what to say. It was smooth, effortless, the way only Steve can deliver. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, a little bit of his signature style, polished but never stiff, and just barely peeking out from beneath the collar of his shirt, his cross necklace. Gold, simple, familiar. It wasn't a prop. It wasn't there for the camera. It was just part of him, like the mustache, the laugh, the southern drawl that sometimes slipped in when he got too passionate. And on this particular day, it sat against his chest like it always did, quiet, personal, steady. The crowd was lively but relaxed. Tourists, fans, mothers, daughters, old couples. Some had waited months for tickets. Others were just happy to be in the room. They didn't know they were about to witness something different, something deeper. Backstage, producers whispered into headsets, running through the final show notes. Everything was moving like clockwork. But there was one name not on the schedule, one chair not accounted for. And Steve? He didn't know yet, not fully. All he knew was that he'd been told to expect a special guest after the next segment. He raised an eyebrow when they told him earlier, but shrugged it off. After all, he'd done 1,000 of these shows. But this wasn't going to be just another episode. And that necklace on his chest? It was about to take center stage. The camera panned to Steve, who stood near the edge of the stage, card in hand. He glanced down at it, then back up at the audience. "All right," he said, smirking. "Now y'all know I don't usually get surprised on my own show, but today," he paused, tapping the card against his palm, "they tell me I got somebody special backstage." The crowd murmured, curious, eager. Steve grinned, playful but suspicious. "Now, they ain't tell me who it is. All they said was, 'You're gonna want to be sitting down.'" He adjusted his jacket, glanced off camera, then pointed. "Y'all got me nervous now." The audience laughed. Some leaned forward, others already had their phones raised. Then the music changed. Slow, regal, familiar. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, Morgan Freeman." Gasps. Applause erupted so hard the cameras shook. A few people stood without realizing it, clapping before they could even process what was happening. From stage left, moving with that deliberate calm that made him famous, came Morgan Freeman. Black blazer, open collar, that iconic voice somehow louder in silence than any microphone ever could be. Steve's mouth dropped open. He stepped back a full 2 steps, blinking like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. "Morgan Freeman," he shouted, pointing. "Hold up, y'all serious?" The two men met in the center of the stage, exchanging a firm handshake and a hug that was more than just polite. It was respect. Real, weighty, mutual. Steve turned to the crowd, arms wide. "Y'all didn't tell me Morgan Freeman was in the building today." The crowd roared again. Morgan smiled, eyes twinkling. "Figured I'd drop in unannounced," he said, voice like velvet and gospel. Steve shook his head, still stunned. "I got the Morgan Freeman on my couch today? Man, I don't even know what to ask. You supposed to be narrating heaven somewhere." Laughter. The energy was electric, but grounded. There was something different in the air. More than celebrity, more than surprise. And neither man, not even Steve, knew yet that this wasn't just going to be a reunion. This was about to become something sacred, something unforgettable. And it was only getting started. They took their seats like two old friends catching up on a Sunday porch. Steve leaned back in his chair, still shaking his head in disbelief. Morgan crossed one leg over the other, his hands resting gently in his lap like he'd been here 1,000 times before. The applause died down, but the energy in the room stayed charged, like everyone knew something special was unfolding. Steve looked over at Morgan and grinned. "Man, I grew up watching you tell stories like you wrote the Bible." Morgan chuckled. "Well, I read it out loud enough times." Laughter rippled through the studio. "Let me tell y'all something," Steve said, turning to the audience. "When Morgan Freeman walks in the room, your voice automatically drops 2 octaves. You gotta sound wise just to keep up." More laughter. But beneath the jokes was something unspoken. Respect. The kind that only comes from time, from weathering storms, and not just surviving, but showing others how to survive too. "You know what I always admired about you?" Steve asked, his voice softening just a bit. "You never changed up to fit in. You stayed Morgan Freeman." Morgan raised a brow, the corner of his mouth twitching. "That's because I already had to wait until I was 50 to get famous. By the time I showed up, I didn't have the energy to pretend." Steve hollered, laughing, slapping his knee. "Whew, you better say that." The audience clapped again, this time less like a reaction and more like an agreement. These weren't just jokes, they were lived-in truths, spoken by 2 men who had earned every wrinkle, every scar, every lesson. There was something generational happening on that stage. 2 icons, 2 different roads, same foundation, honor, faith, identity, realness. And even though the smiles were wide and the conversation felt light, there was a weight in the air, like the moment had more to say, like something deeper was waiting its turn to speak. And then it did. Morgan turned in his seat just slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in judgment, but in thought. The tone changed. It wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, intentional, the kind of shift you feel more than hear. "Steve," he said slowly, "can I ask you something?" Steve nodded, eyes still warm. "Of course, man." Morgan glanced down, then back up. "That cross necklace you wear," he gestured towards Steve's collar. "You wear that every time I see you on television. Every photo, every appearance. Why do you still wear it?" The audience got quiet, like real quiet. The kind of quiet where people lean in, phones lower, eyes widen. Not out of shock, but because they knew this wasn't going to be a soundbite. This was about to get real. Steve looked down at the necklace, almost surprised by the question. He reached up, gently pulling it out from under his collar so it rested over his shirt. It caught the light just enough to shine. He smiled, not for the cameras, but the kind of smile you give when someone touches a part of you that never changed. "It's who I am," he said simply. "Always has been." There was no applause, not yet, because the words didn't need decoration. They just landed. Steve didn't rush to explain. He let it breathe. Then he looked over at Morgan and continued. "My mama gave me this cross when I was a broke man with 3 jobs and a dream. She said, 'Don't let that dream take you further than God can find you.'" Morgan nodded, his expression still, his eyes deeper than the question itself. "And so I wear it," Steve added. "Not for show, not for nobody else. I wear it to remind myself every day I step out in front of that camera, who got me here." The audience stirred, a few quiet amens, a sniffle or two. Steve turned to them, then back to Morgan. "I'm not ashamed of what I believe, and I ain't gonna tuck it in just to make people comfortable." Morgan didn't interrupt. He just sat there listening, his eyes locked on Steve's. And in that moment, it stopped being an interview. It became a testimony. Morgan didn't speak right away. He sat still, fingers laced together, the soft hum of studio lights filling the silence. You could feel the weight of the moment pressing gently into the space between him and Steve. Then he exhaled. Slow, thoughtful. "You know," Morgan began, his voice almost a whisper, "that necklace, it's more than a symbol." Steve looked over, the grin from before, now fading into something more contemplative. Morgan continued, never raising his voice, never rushing, just telling the truth. "It's a light," he said, "in a world that's forgotten how to believe." The audience didn't clap. They didn't move. It was that kind of silence that felt sacred, like church. Not the building, but the feeling you get when you walk in and your soul recognizes something eternal. Steve blinked. Once, slowly. Morgan kept going, his voice smooth, but now layered with something deeper, reverence. "I've worked in this industry for over 5 decades, he said. "I've seen the spotlight change people. I've watched good men forget where they came from, watched strong women swallow their faith to fit someone else's idea of what's acceptable." Steve's expression shifted. No punchline, no deflection. Just quiet. Still. Moved. Morgan leaned in slightly. "But you? You wore that cross before the suits, before the lights? And somehow, you still wear it now." Steve didn't speak, and he couldn't. His eyes were glassy, his jaw clenched just a little, like a man holding back a flood behind a dam that's starting to crack. Morgan looked at him with something that felt like both admiration and a gentle challenge. "People see it," he said. "Even when you don't say a word about it, they see it." The camera zoomed in slightly, not too close, just enough to catch the shift in Steve's posture. Shoulders that had once carried jokes now carried something heavier, something holy. And for the first time that episode, Steve Harvey didn't have anything to say, because some words don't need a reply, they just need to land. And Morgan Freeman, he had just landed a truth that hit harder than any applause ever could. Morgan sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his voice. It had taken on a gravity that pulled everyone in. "There's something people don't talk about in our world," he said, his eyes scanning the audience. "In this industry, in this culture." He paused, then looked right at Steve. "It's the cost of keeping your faith in plain sight." Steve sat still, hands folded, that necklace now resting fully over his shirt, no longer tucked, no longer subtle. Morgan's words were calm, but piercing. "You ever notice how quick they are to cheer for the broken parts of you, but get uncomfortable when you talk about what made you whole?" The audience murmured. Quiet agreement. Soft mm-hms from the back row. Morgan kept going. "I've sat in green rooms with actors afraid to mention they believe in God. I've known singers who were told not to thank Jesus in their award speeches because it might alienate somebody." He said the word with air quotes so sharp you could feel the sarcasm cut the air. "I've seen people rewrite themselves to stay marketable." Then he turned back to Steve. "But you didn't fold. Even when the world told you to dim your light, you let it shine." Steve's lips parted just slightly, like he wanted to respond, but couldn't find the words. Because when someone speaks something you've lived, it hits different. "You walk on this stage," Morgan continued, "with millions watching, and you still let that cross sit on your chest like it belongs there." He looked down for a second, then up again. "That takes courage, brother." Steve inhaled deeply, his eyes wet now, but not from sadness, from being seen, from someone finally saying out loud what it costs to stand firm in a world that keeps shifting. Morgan glanced toward the audience. "Faith used to be something people stood on. Now they're told to stand down." He looked back to Steve. "But you still standing." The crowd was silent, but not still. People wiped their eyes. Some nodded. One woman in the front whispered, "Thank you, Jesus." "And Steve?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed, not in defeat, but in reverence. Because when truth shows up dressed like grace, all you can do is feel it. And he was feeling it. Morgan's voice dropped to a near whisper, but somehow it echoed louder than ever. "You know who's watching you, Steve?" he asked, eyes fixed on him. Steve didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight in Morgan's tone already told him This wasn't a question that needed an answer. Morgan leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, the kind of posture that said, "This matters. You got millions watching you every day, but it ain't just fans or folks looking for a laugh." He paused. "It's young black men." The crowd went still again, not tense, just fully tuned in. Morgan's words came slow, measured, as if he knew each one was going to stay with Steve for the rest of his life. "They see you up here, suit sharp, smile wide, making people laugh, building businesses, changing lives. But most of all, they see that cross." He nodded toward Steve's chest. "And when they see that cross, they don't just see jewelry." He paused again. "They see permission to believe." Steve blinked. Once, twice. His lips trembled just slightly. Morgan didn't stop. "You got boys growing up in places where hope is scarce, where nobody tells them it's okay to believe in something bigger than themselves, but they turn on that TV, and there you are." He gestured toward the crowd. "A man who came from nothing, who made it, and who still wears that symbol with pride." A tear slid down the side of Steve's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Morgan looked at him, not as a fellow celebrity, not as a guest on a couch, but like a father speaking into the soul of a son. "You don't know how many chains you've broken just by refusing to take that one off." The crowd sat still, some mouths open, some wiping tears. Steve bowed his head. His hands gripped the arms of the chair like they were holding more than wood, like they were holding the weight of every young man who ever looked in the mirror and wondered if they could still believe in something real. And in that moment, Steve Harvey didn't just feel seen, he felt called. Steve took a deep breath. The room didn't ask him to speak, it waited. Because you don't rush a man who's carrying memory on his back? He looked down at the necklace, the gold cross now glowing gently under the soft lights of the studio. "You know," he began, his voice low, thick, like it had to push through a lump in his throat to make it out, "that cross ain't just something I wear, it's a reminder." He paused, as if his mind had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere far from the studio, the cameras, and the stage. "I was a little boy in West Virginia," he said, his gaze distant now, staring past the crowd, "back when things were hard, and we didn't have much, didn't always have dinner, but we had God." The audience stayed perfectly still. "My mama," he said softly, "she gave me this necklace when I was 17. I was leaving the house thinking I was a man. I was full of big talk and even bigger dreams." He chuckled under his breath, but there was sadness underneath it. "She said, 'Boy, this necklace don't make you holy.'" He paused, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "But it'll remind you who you walking with." Someone in the audience whispered, "Whew," and another softly said, "Amen." Steve looked up at Morgan, eyes glassy, and for a moment he wasn't the host anymore. He wasn't the entrepreneur or the comedian. He was that 17-year-old kid again, standing at the edge of the world with nothing but a dream and a mama's faith stitched into a gold chain. "That stuck with me," he said. "Through every rejection, every failure, every night I slept in my car, I'd reach up, grab this chain, and remind myself I ain't alone." The lights felt warmer now, the silence deeper. Morgan nodded, a knowing look in his eyes, a look that said, "I remember that kind of woman. I remember that kind of faith." And the crowd? They weren't watching a talk show anymore. They were watching a man peel back years of fame, layer by layer, until all that was left was faith, family, and the quiet strength of a promise kept. You could feel it, not just see it, not just hear it. The whole studio had changed. Something sacred was happening, and everyone knew it. The audience, once lively and full of laughter, now sat in still reverence. Some leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands over mouths. Others quietly wiped tears from their cheeks with tissues pulled from purses or sleeves. A grown man in the second row lowered his head, hand over his heart, and in the center of it all, Steve sat in silence, shoulders hunched slightly, eyes glassy, cross shining on his chest. He wasn't putting on a show. He wasn't trying to carry the moment. He was just present. And then slowly, Morgan reached over. Not dramatic, not performative, just a hand placed gently on Steve's shoulder, reassuring, grounding, and with a voice soft enough to feel like a whisper but deep enough to settle in everyone's bones, he said, "You've turned a symbol into a testimony." Steve's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to, because some moments aren't meant for applause, they're meant for reflection. There was a holiness in the silence, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, they weren't in a studio anymore, but somewhere higher. Somewhere where stories mattered, where faith still echoed, where vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was worship. Morgan didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. His hand stayed on Steve's shoulder for a moment longer before he let it go, leaning back in his chair, eyes still fixed on the man beside him. And Steve? He sat there breathing heavy, like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had just been lifted in front of millions. The chain around his neck hadn't moved, but it had never spoken louder. Steve opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out, just a breath, just a sound that wasn't a word, but carried the weight of 1,000 of them. His lips trembled. His hands gripped the edge of his chair. And then his voice cracked. He started, then paused, choking on the sentence before it could even begin. He reached up, fumbling slightly, as he unclipped the mic from his tie, his fingers shaking. The audience gasped, not out of shock, but because they knew. They knew what they were witnessing was not just a man getting emotional, it was a man coming undone in the most beautiful, honest way. Steve set the mic down on the side table next to him gently, carefully, like it was suddenly too heavy to carry. His head dropped, and the tears came. No sobbing, no breakdown, just quiet, steady tears falling from a face worn by wisdom, humility, and grace. He wiped one away with the back of his hand, then shook his head slowly. A man trying to understand the moment, trying to take it all in. He whispered, voice barely audible, I just never thought it mattered this much. It wasn't a performance, it was a confession. The kind that comes from years of wearing something close to your heart, not for anyone else, but for you. And suddenly realizing the world had been watching the whole time. He looked up, eyes red, raw, and full of something deeper than gratitude. It was revelation, realization that his quiet act of faith hadn't gone unnoticed. It had echoed, and now it had come back to him in the form of Morgan Freeman's voice, an audience's silence, and a moment he never saw coming. Tears still streamed down his face, but for once, Steve Harvey didn't try to talk through them. He just let them fall. At first, no one moved. Then, slowly, one woman in the third row stood to her feet, hands gently clapping together. A few others followed, hesitant at first, then sure. Within seconds, the entire studio was on their feet. Applause erupted, not the kind that says, "That was a good show," but the kind that says, "Thank you for showing us something real." The camera panned across the room, capturing it all. Faces lit with emotion, some smiling through tears, others wiping them away. A middle-aged man in the front row nodded solemnly, hand over heart. A young woman mouthed the words, "Thank you," through her tears. It wasn't just appreciation, it was witnessing. On stage, Steve sat still for a moment longer, overwhelmed, a man quietly trying to find his center again. He took a breath, wiped his face with both hands, and looked over at Morgan, his voice soft, fragile, but full of meaning. "Thank you, man. I don't even know what to say," he whispered, his voice trembling. Morgan didn't reply with words. He just reached out and gave Steve's shoulder a firm squeeze, a gesture that said, "You don't have to say anything. We felt it." Steve turned to the audience, managing a small smile. "Y'all, I don't cry on TV," he said with a short laugh, still wiping his eyes. but I guess God had other plans today. The crowd laughed gently through their clapping, the emotional tension breaking just enough for a shared exhale. It wasn't just a standing ovation for a man who'd bared his soul. It was a standing ovation for truth, for faith, for the moment when one man's private conviction became a public reminder that light still shines in the most unexpected places. The applause faded, but the emotion stayed heavy in the room, thick, sacred, unshaken. Morgan looked over at Steve, his eyes soft but unwavering. "Steve," he said gently, "would it be all right if I said a prayer over you?" The question didn't hang long. Steve nodded immediately, placing a hand over his chest, right where the cross rested. "Yes, sir," he whispered. The room fell completely silent. Even the crew in the back lowered their heads, cameras still rolling, but no movement, no fidgeting, just reverence. Morgan closed his eyes and began. "Lord," his voice dropped low, smooth like flowing water, but rooted like an oak tree. "We thank you for this man, for the strength you gave him to stand in rooms that tried to shrink him, for the courage to wear your name even when the world told him not to." Steve closed his eyes. A single tear slipped down his cheek. Morgan continued, "Thank you for giving him a platform, not just to entertain, but to inspire, to remind the lost they can still be found, and to remind the broken they're still loved." He paused just briefly, letting the weight of the words settle. "Cover him, Lord. Cover his family, protect his voice, let his light shine not because it's loud, but because it's true." The room was still. No sniffles, no movement, just the kind of quiet you only find in prayer. Morgan opened his eyes and looked at Steve. "And let him know, Father, that the necklace ain't just a symbol on his chest. It's your hand on his life." "Amen." A whisper of responses rippled through the room. "Amen. Yes, Lord. Thank you." Steve looked up, eyes full, heart open. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to, because in that moment, something holy had happened. On air, and everyone knew it. The episode aired just 2 days later. No special promotion, no teaser, just the usual time slot and a simple caption. A conversation that changed everything. But from the moment it hit the screen, the world began to shift. The clip of Steve Harvey breaking down went viral within hours, shared by pastors, influencers, celebrities, and ordinary people who had no idea a talk show could carry the weight of a sermon. Trending instantly, # Steve Harvey cries. Morgan Freeman prayer. Faith on TV. One clip, barely 60 seconds long, showed Morgan laying his hand on Steve's shoulder. Another captured Steve whispering, "I just never thought it mattered this much." The internet didn't just react, it responded. Comment sections turned into digital revival tents. "I haven't been to church in years, but this brought me back to God. I wore my cross under my shirt at work, not anymore. My son watched this and asked if it was okay for him to pray at school." Twitter threads filled with testimonies, TikToks stitched together clips of the moment with personal stories of loss, redemption, and rediscovered faith. A woman in Georgia posted a video of her grandfather watching the prayer segment on repeat, tears in his eyes. "He hasn't cried since my grandma passed," she wrote. "He said today felt like she was sitting beside him." News outlets picked it up. Steve Harvey and Morgan Freeman bring faith back to daytime TV. A moment of grace, the interview that touched a nation. But it wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about healing, about hope, and the quiet realization that in a world full of noise, the truth still had a place. What started as a personal moment became a movement. Within 48 hours of the episode airing, searches for Steve Harvey cross necklace spiked online. Retailers reported a surge in sales for gold and silver crosses, simple designs, understated, just like the one Steve wore. But this wasn't fashion, it was testimony. Churches across the country, black, white, rural, urban, played the clip in Sunday services. Youth pastors used it to spark conversations with teenagers about identity, courage, and standing for something that lasts. A small congregation in Mississippi projected the prayer on a wall during altar call. A megachurch in Dallas used it to kick off a sermon series called Unashamed. In Detroit, a teacher played the episode for her high school seniors. One student raised his hand afterward and asked, "Do you think it's too late for someone like me to believe?" People who had long hidden their faith at work started wearing their crosses again, not as a challenge, not to be bold or rebellious, but as a quiet declaration. This is who I am. A mother shared a photo of her daughter, 7 years old, holding up a tiny necklace and beaming. The caption read, "She asked for one just like Mr. Harvey's, said she wanted to be brave like him." And Steve? He didn't say much. A short post, no filter, just a photo of his necklace resting in the palm of his hand. It's always been his. I just finally understood why. Because that single moment, a tear, a touch, a prayer, had become something more. A symbol, a spark, and for thousands, maybe millions, a reason to believe again. The stage looked the same lights, same desk, same chair, but the energy was different, calmer, quieter, like the air itself had been humbled. There was no guest, no band playing, no crowd cheering, just Steve, sitting alone at center stage, his suit dark, his hands folded gently in front of him, the camera pushed in slowly. No dramatic music, no cue cards in his hand, just the necklace. It hung a little more visible than usual, resting neatly outside his shirt, catching the light every so often, like it was winking at the world. Steve looked down at it, then held it gently between his fingers. He didn't smile right away. He just breathed. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice softer than usual, "about that moment, the one y'all saw with me and Morgan." The screen cut briefly to a flashback. Steve in tears, Morgan's hand on his shoulder, the studio frozen in reverence. Back to Steve now, present day, different tone. "I've been on TV for a long time," he said, "told a lot of jokes, made a lot of people laugh. But that day?" He shook his head slightly, blinking back the memory. "That day reminded me this ain't just about me, or even about Morgan." He looked directly into the camera now, not through it, into it. "It's about all of us," he said. "Every single person out there who's ever been made to feel like they gotta tuck their faith away just to make somebody else comfortable." He held up the necklace now, not as a display, but as a statement. "This little thing right here," he said, "it ain't magic. It don't make me perfect. But it reminds me of who walks with me, and I ain't ashamed of that." A pause, a breath. Then, "We live in a world that tells you to keep quiet about what you believe, that it's old-fashioned, out of touch, too loud, too much." He leaned forward slightly. "But I'm here to tell you, you don't have to hide the light." Silence, a quiet that felt like peace. He set the necklace gently back down against his chest, patting it once. Then he looked into the lens with a smile, not flashy, not for show, just real. "Let it shine, y'all." The screen faded to black, and across it, in simple white letters, appeared the words, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." John 1:5. The episode ended, but the message, it stayed. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.